Day 4. The world outside was a banshee, a solid wall of screaming white that had not ceased its assault for 96 hours. Inside, there was only the deep, resonant thrum of the mountain. It was not a sound one heard with the ears, but a vibration felt in the bones, a low hum that traveled through the stone floor, up the legs of the simple wooden chairs, and into the marrow of the two women who sat in stillness by the fire. Abigail, her hands resting in the lap of her light brown prairie dress, watched the flames. Her mother, Eleanor, her face a road map of 70 years, worked a needle through a piece of mending, her movement small and certain. At the door, a massive German shepherd named Kaiser lay with his head on his paws, utterly motionless, a sentinel carved from shadow and patience. From their single, large window, there was nothing to see of the town of Prosperity below. Not a roofline, not a wisp of smoke, not even the proud steeple of the community hall. The valley had been erased, buried under a shifting sea of white so deep it had swallowed the world they once knew. The cabin, tucked into the immense, arching mouth of a cave, was an island of calm in a universe of chaos. The wind howled and shrieked against the granite face of the peak, but here, inside the mountain's embrace, it was only a distant, muffled roar, the sound of a caged beast pacing far away. Abigail rose and walked to the window, laying a hand against the cool glass. The snow was not falling so much as it was moving horizontally, a river of ice and air. How many feet deep was it now? 10? 15? More? She had stopped measuring yesterday. There was no longer a frame of reference. The very tops of the tallest pines in the valley had vanished. She thought of her ledger, of the columns of numbers, the barometric readings, the careful notes on wind direction. Data she could see and quantify. But how does one measure the weight of silence? 8 months earlier, that same view had been one of vibrant life. From this same vantage on the ridge, Abigail could see the grid of streets, the puff of the blacksmith's forge, the glint of sun on the windows of the mercantile. It was a town nestled in a bowl, a fact that had brought her late husband, a man of maps and transits, a deep and abiding unease. He had spoken of it often, his finger tracing the topographical lines on one of his charts. He saw how the high peaks funneled the wind, how the valley floor was a natural basin for whatever the sky chose to discard. After he was gone, his words remained, echoing in the quiet of her small widow's plot at the edge of town. She had sold that plot within a month, a decision that had sent the first ripples of concern through Prosperity. She began walking the mountains, not as a mourner seeking solace, but as a surveyor seeking truth. She wore the same simple dress every day, its light brown fabric soon dusty from the mountain trails. Her dog, Kaiser, was her silent companion. She learned the feel of the rock under her hands, the way the air grew colder in certain ravines, the paths the water took after a hard rain. She was not looking for a place to live, she was looking for a place to survive. She found it on a Tuesday in early spring. It wasn't a true cave, not a deep, wet passage into the earth's guts. It was a vast rock shelter, a monumental alcove gouged from the granite cliff face by millennia of wind and ice, 100 feet wide and half as deep, with a ceiling that arched 40 feet above a floor of flat, solid stone. It faced southeast, protected from the prevailing northwesterlies. Kaiser, who had been scouting ahead, went utterly still at its entrance before trotting inside, his paws making no sound on the rock. He circled the space once, then lay down near the back wall, content. That was all the confirmation Abigail needed. This was the place. The plan took shape not in daydreams, but in the ruled columns of her husband's old ledger. It was a drawing of stark simplicity, a small, sturdy cabin to be built entirely within the footprint of the rock shelter. The mountain itself would be 3 of its walls and its roof. She would need to build only a foundation, a single forward-facing wall with a door and a large window, and a handful of interior partitions. When she showed the drawing to her mother, Eleanor's hands trembled slightly. A house inside a hole in the rock, Abigail? It's a den, not a home. What will people say? Her mother's fears were practical, grounded in a lifetime of convention. And the timber? The stove? How can one woman and a dog move a house up a mountain? Abigail simply pointed to the drawing. The mountain is the windbreak, Mother. The stone holds the sun's warmth. The ground will never be washed away. Her logic was as solid and unadorned as the rock itself. In town, her logic was met with open amusement. She went to Sterling's lumber yard for the timber, her drawing laid out on the counter. Mr. Sterling, a man whose wealth was matched only by his condescension, peered at it over his spectacles. "Playing squirrel, are we, madam?" "Hiding your nuts for the winter," he chuckled, the sound thick and dismissive. He sold her the wood at a premium. She then sought out Thomas, the town's most respected carpenter, to ask about anchoring a floor plate to stone. He scoffed, wiping his hands on his apron. "The ground shifts on a mountain. Frost heaves. A fool's foundation, that's what you'll have." Mayor Croft made it a matter of public record, speaking from the steps of the town hall. "This town has stood for 50 years through every season. We don't need hysterics from the widow on the ridge." The name stuck. It became a piece of communal irony, a shorthand for eccentricity. Abigail paid it no mind. She paid her bills, loaded her wagon, and headed for the mountain. The work was a slow, grinding meditation. Each piece of timber, every bag of mortar, every pane of glass had to be hauled up the winding switchback trail she had cleared herself, first by wagon to the base, then by a stubborn mule named Patience up the steep incline. There was no partner to ask for a second opinion, no crew to share the load. There was only Abigail, her own methodical mind serving as foreman, her husband surveying principles her guide. She spent the first 2 weeks creating the foundation, not by digging down, but by building up. She and her mother, whose initial protests had given way to a worried, silent loyalty, gathered flat stones from the scree field below the cave. They mixed mortar in a wheelbarrow, their movements falling into a shared rhythm. Eleanor never said she believed in the plan, but her hands, chapped and grey with cement, were proof of her faith in her daughter. Abigail anchored the base of her wooden frame directly to the rock with iron pins and mortar, creating a bond she knew would be as unyielding as the mountain itself. The walls rose slowly, one plank at a time. The scent of fresh-cut pine mingled with the ancient, dusty smell of the cave. Kaiser watched every step of the construction, his head cocked, a silent overseer. He would often nudge Abigail's hand with his nose as if to inspect her work before settling back down. Visuals of the process became a silent film of resolve, close-ups of Abigail's hands, scarred and strong, driving a nail with perfect economy of motion, the ledger lying open on a rock, its pages held down by a stone, diagrams and numbers stark against the white paper, a wide shot of the small wooden structure taking shape within the immense, yawning maw of the cave, a ship being built inside a bottle of stone. The town's mockery was a distant hum. Up here, the only sounds were the wind, the hammer, and the quiet murmur of 2 women working against a silent, looming clock. By late autumn, the cabin was complete. A single, stout wall of timber faced the valley, inset with a door of reinforced oak and one large, multi-paned window that drank the morning light. Inside, the space was divided into a main living area, 2 small sleeping rooms, and a pantry carved directly into the softest part of the rear rock wall. The iron stove, its pipe vented through a natural fissure in the cave ceiling that Abigail had painstakingly widened and lined, stood as the home's warm heart. With the structure finished, Abigail began a new ritual. Every morning and every evening, she made an entry in her ledger. The date, the temperature, the barometric pressure from an old brass instrument her husband had treasured, and her own observations on the wind, which she judged by the frantic dance of a lone, resilient pine visible from her window. Down in prosperity, the joke had matured. "Thinking of a picnic, Croft? Best ask the widow on the ridge if we'll need our coats." The laughter in the mercantile was easy and confident. The postal clerk, Samuel, a man of few words and fewer opinions, was the only one who did not participate. When a small, delicate replacement needle for her barometer arrived by mail order, he handed it to her with a quiet nod, his eyes glancing at the thick, worn ledger in her satchel. He said nothing. He simply observed. One evening in November, as the first serious cold snap settled over the peaks, a profound disquiet fell over the cabin. Eleanor felt it first. "The wind sounds angry tonight," she murmured, pulling her shawl tighter. But it was the dog who gave the true warning. Kaiser, normally a creature of profound calm, refused to settle. He paced the length of the main room, his claws making a soft, clicking sound on the wooden floor. He would stop at the window, staring down into the black, star-dusted valley, a low whine vibrating in his chest. Then he would move to the door, pressing his nose to the crack at the bottom, sniffing the air. He was a living barometer, and his needle was pointing to danger. The storm began not with a roar, but a whisper. A soft, steady fall of impossibly large snowflakes. In Prosperity, children ran outside with their mouths open to the sky. It was the first real snow of the season, a beautiful, festive blanket. By noon, it had not stopped. By dusk, the beautiful blanket had become a heavy quilt. Abigail stood at her window, watching. Her ledger entry for the day was sparse. Day 1. Snowfall constant. 6 inches by noon, 14 by dusk. Wind from the north-northeast. Barometer falling sharply since sunrise. Inside the mountain cabin, the world was muffled. The stone walls of the great cave absorbed the rising shriek of the wind, reducing it to a low, resonant hum. Eleanor stoked the fire in the stove, the gentle hiss and crackle a comforting counterpoint to the storm's muffled fury. Kaiser no longer paced. He now lay pressed against the solid oak door, a low, continuous growl of physical vibration against the wood, his gaze fixed on the unseen world outside. The pace of the world had changed. Sentences became shorter. Thoughts became simpler. Stay warm. Stay safe. Watch. Through the window, the town of Prosperity began to dissolve. First, the fences vanished. Then, the wagons and woodpiles. By the morning of the second day, the snow had crept up the walls of the houses, covering windows, erasing the familiar lines of the world below. A vast, indifferent whiteness was consuming everything. Abigail's entries became clipped, factual. Day 2. Snow depth immeasurable. Drifts exceed 12 feet in exposed areas. Wind constant. Visibility 0. The town of Prosperity was gone, and the storm was just beginning. Down in the valley, the festive mood had frozen and died. By the third day, the snow was no longer a novelty, it was a predator. It piled in massive drifts against doors, sealing people inside their homes. The weight of it was immense, terrifying. It wasn't just snow, it was a physical pressure, a force of nature intent on crushing the town flat. The wind, funneled by the peaks just as Abigail's husband had predicted, became a battering ram. It found every loose board, every weak seam. The roof of the general store was the first to go, peeling away in the night with a sound like a giant tearing canvas. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Mayor Croft, a man accustomed to leading through speeches and handshakes, found himself powerless. He tried to organize a digging party, but the wind and snow drove them back within minutes, half frozen and defeated. His voice, usually so commanding, was a thin, useless thread in the gale. Thomas the carpenter, a man who built his life on the certainty of plumb lines and right angles, listened to the structure of his own fine house groan and pop under the astronomical weight of the snow on its roof. He had built it to last, but he had not built it for this. This was a different kind of physics. Miles away, in his sprawling, exposed mansion on the valley's edge, Mr. Sterling felt the full, vindictive force of the blizzard. The grand windows on the north side had shattered, and the wind was gutting his home, filling it with snow and ice. The running joke about the widow on the ridge was a bitter memory now. There was no laughter in Prosperity. There was only the scream of the wind and, in the lulls, a silence more frightening than the noise, the sound of a town being buried alive. On the fourth day, a new sound reached the cabin on the ridge. It was not the wind. It was a sharp, percussive crack that echoed strangely through the dense, snow-filled air, followed by a low, grinding groan. A sound of catastrophic failure. The storm abated for a few minutes, the curtain of white thinning just enough for a distorted view of the valley. Abigail saw it then. The roof of the town hall had collapsed inward. The proud bell tower, the very symbol of their community, was gone, snapped off like a twig. The town was not just buried, it was breaking. She turned from the window, her face grim, and met her mother's wide, fearful eyes. They did not need to speak. Later that afternoon, another sound came, closer this time. Faint, desperate, rhythmic. A banging. It was not the wind. It was not the mountain. Kaiser was instantly on his feet, not growling, but whining softly, his tail giving a single, uncertain thump against the floor. He went to the door, his ears perked. The banging came again, a frantic, muffled drumming against the outer face of the cliff somewhere below the cave's mouth. Abigail took a deep breath. She pulled on her thickest coat, wrapped a scarf over her face, and looked at her mother. Eleanor simply nodded, her hand clutching the worn arm of her chair. Abigail unbolted the heavy oak door. A blast of ice and wind tore into the room, sending papers flying and making the fire gutter wildly. A figure, a moving mound of snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed onto the cabin floor. It was Thomas, the carpenter. His face was a mask of frozen blood and ice, his breathing a ragged, painful gasp. He tried to push himself up, his eyes wild with desperation and disbelief as he took in the warm, quiet, impossible room. "The mayor sent me," he rasped, his voice cracking. "The town, it's gone. Is there room?" The sun on the 6th day was an act of violence. It was blinding, brilliant, reflecting off a world remade in white. The storm had broken, leaving behind a profound, crystalline silence. The view from Abigail's window was of a new landscape, a rolling desert of snow beneath which lay the grave of a town. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp wool, and broth. 13 people from Prosperity were huddled in the small space. Mayor Croft sat on a crate, staring into the middle distance, his authority stripped away, leaving only a tired, frightened old man. Mr. Sterling, his fine clothes ruined, was wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, shivering despite the warmth of the stove. Thomas the carpenter sat nearest the fire, his hands, the tools of his trade, wrapped in clean rags. There was no mockery in their eyes now. There was only a quiet, stunned awe. The humbled admission did not come as an apology, but as a quiet statement of fact. Sterling, looking up not at Abigail but at the solid rock ceiling of the cave that arched over the cabin, spoke to no one in particular. His voice was a hoarse whisper. "We called it the widow's folly," he paused, swallowing hard. "We were the fools." It was Samuel, the postal clerk, who ultimately chronicled the vindication. When the first rescue parties on snowshoes finally broke through to the valley 2 weeks later, they found a town shattered and a handful of survivors sheltered in a place of legend. Samuel's log, kept meticulously even through the disaster, became the official record. Alongside his own notes on the town's collapse were columns of data he had copied from Abigail's ledger, which Thomas had carried with him on his desperate climb. The falling barometric pressures, the wind speed notations, the snowfall measurements, a precise, data-driven prophecy of the catastrophe, all recorded before the first flake had fallen. The story of the widow on the ridge and her weather log became inseparable from the story of the great blizzard itself. Years passed. The town of Prosperity was rebuilt, but it was a different town, a humbler town. The new houses were not built in the lowest parts of the valley. Their roofs were pitched at steeper, sharper angles to shed the snow. Their foundations were sunk deeper, anchored with a new respect for the power of the earth and sky. The path to Abigail's home was now well worn. They no longer called it the widow's folly. It was simply the Ridge House, a landmark, a lesson written in timber and stone. Pilgrims came, not for salvation, but for knowledge. Young homesteaders, families new to the territory, would make the climb, their own fresh ledgers in hand. They would sit at Abigail's table, and she would speak to them of wind channels, of load-bearing strata, of the way the air tastes before a hard frost. She never preached, she only shared what she had observed. Her mother, Eleanor, lived to see her daughter's strange vision become the new wisdom of the valley. The aging German shepherd, Kaiser, still lay by the door, a grey muzzle resting on his paws, his presence a silent testament to the long-ago warning. One afternoon, Abigail stood with her mother at the window, looking out not at a disaster, but at a renewal. On a neighboring hillside, higher than anyone would have dared to build a decade ago, a new family was laying the stone foundation for their home. They were building it against the shelter of a rock outcropping, its main window facing southeast, away from the path of the winter gales. A quiet smile touched Abigail's lips. She placed a hand on her mother's shoulder. "They're listening to the mountain now," she said, her voice soft. Eleanor patted her daughter's hand, her gaze on the distant builders. And that was enough.